the great fundamental issue now before our people can be stated briefly. It is, are the American people fit to govern themselves, to rule themselves, to control themselves? I believe they are. My opponents do not.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
Whether we shape the future in the image of our hopes is ours is to determine by our actions. If we succeed, generations to come will say of us now living that we mastered our moment. Americanism, not globalism, will be our credo.
Continuing the great American tradition of patriotic dissent. This is The Right Take.
How is it going, everybody? Welcome, welcome. This is episode number 81 here of The Right Take. I'm Eric Lindrum, here with my co-host Jacob Grandstaff. And by the way, gotta give a shout out. You guys may have noticed that intro now, along with the previous two intros. That's a different voice coming in to introduce the show. Of course, we've been using lines from our good buddy Alex Hall, who did an episode with us way back when. Those new liners come to you courtesy of our most recent in-studio guest, Kyle Winter, again, a former radio host himself, and those liners are courtesy of him. We have more in the pipeline that we are going to be debuting over the course of the coming weeks, tracking, of course, with the classic synthwave, vaporwave music that has become a staple of our show. So thanks again, Kyle, for that. Had to acknowledge your contribution to the Right Take history. It's the final countdown, guys. We are less than 30 days away from the midterm election cycle of the year 2022. November the 8th is election day. We are going to continue our laser focus on elections between now and November the 8th. We're going to be focusing more in the coming weeks on the specific categories of races, namely the U.S. Senate, the U.S. House, and governorships. And what is the most important one? What's the one that everyone has been talking about? It's the U.S. Senate. Realistically, Republicans are going to take the House of Representatives back. It may not be a very big majority, but it will be a majority. If they manage to fail that, then the party should just roll over and die at that point. Redistricting has been in their favor. There are multiple very vulnerable Democrats up for re-election. Again, newly red seats that are now more favorable to Republicans. They're going to take the House. But we've got to talk about the U.S. Senate, the upper chamber, and give a quick summary, the Wikipedia summary, as you will, of how Republicans can win it and how they can lose it. So again, after the 2020 election, particularly in the Georgia runoffs, The Senate stands at 50-50 right now. Technically speaking, it's 50-48-2 when you consider two independent senators, Angus King from Maine and, of course, Bernie Sanders from Vermont, but they're basically Democrats. They vote with the Democrats all the time. They caucus with the Democrats. The incumbent vice president is the tie-breaking vote who has broken the ties on several votes before. So they have a majority. They have an effective majority in the U.S. Senate right now, which means Republicans need just one. They need a net gain of one seat to break that majority. Should be easy.
One job this fall.
They have
just one job.
They have
one seat.
One job. And if there's one political entity in the United States today that is capable of messing up one job, it's the Republican Party. You think it would be easy, right? Wrong. It's not the greatest map. The Senate map in 2022 is kind of to Republicans what the 2018 map was to Democrats. The historical midterm cycle always goes that the opposition party always gains seats in a midterm election. It just always happens. It's especially prominent during a president's second term. That's what's known as the 6-year itch, where after 6 years of the incumbent president, their party gets decimated. But even in first-term midterms, it is true as well.
I would like to bring us back to 2018, just briefly to remind people of what played out in that Senate race. The Democrats were set to win, not only win, but win big in that Senate election, just as big as they did with the House. It was going to be a blue wave. The only reason why they didn't was because of President Trump's campaigning abilities and his rally abilities. If you remember, in August, he started rallying for House candidates. And starting in September, he focused exclusively on the Senate. And I feel like he dragged a lot of really bad Republican candidates kicking and screaming over the finish line. And the Democrats have no one like Trump in this election. They have no one who can step in and drag bad Democratic Senate candidates across the finish line. So this is the one advantage that Republicans have in this situation.
Yeah, if anything, Democrats are running away from their president, of course, whose primary endorsement record is not great. Again, the very first primary endorsement he made in 2022 was for Congressman Kurt Schrader out of Oregon, a very moderate, apparently the Joe Manchin of the House. And he lost his primary to a hardcore progressive leftist. So Biden certainly does not draw crowds. He draws maybe about 10 people to his rally, and half of them are reporters. So Henry Kissinger, who is no fan of Trump, said not too long ago that he has not seen any president in his lifetime able to command such a massive, enthusiastic, and loyal following of anyone, at least since Franklin D. Roosevelt. But yeah, the Senate map in 2018 was already beneficial to Republicans. They flipped seats in North Dakota, Missouri, and Indiana, and of course they managed to barely flip Florida, which was a huge win, whereas Democrats managed to flip seats in Nevada and Arizona. But ultimately, despite it being, supposedly a blue wave, they took the House, it technically was not a blue wave. They had net gains in governorships and the House, but the Republicans walked away with a net gain in the Senate by picking up 2 more seats, which brought them up to 53. So back to 2022, like I said, it's kind of the reversal now. In 2018, there were more Democrat seats up as well than there were Republican seats. The reverse is true here in 2022. There are 6 Republicans retiring, so Republican-held seats with the incumbents on their way out, and 1 Democrat senator is retiring. That's Patrick Leahy in Vermont. Other than those, you have 15 Republicans and 13 Democrats total running for re-election. And just take one look at the map. It's not great. You've got Republican seats up throughout the Rust Belt in Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania, as well as a few others that are kind of safely red now, although they were swing states not too long ago, like Iowa and Missouri. Florida, Marco Rubio's up for re-election there, North Carolina. Then there's really only a handful of Democrat seats up. Most of them are deep blue seats, California, New York, Vermont, et cetera, et cetera. Right now, the overall trends, the polling numbers, and of course, again, the historical trends seem to suggest the Republicans are going to do fine. They're probably going to make a net gain of anywhere from 1 to 3 seats. They're going to retake the majority. Everything's going to be cool, guys. But there is actually 1 Senate seat, 1 state that could actually be the ultimate monkey wrench in the GOP's plans, that could completely throw all of their hopes of a Senate majority to the wind, that they will not have seen coming until it is already too late. And we're going to have a special guest joining us to talk about this race in particular. We're looking forward to that discussion shortly. But to go over the map briefly, and again, to summarize some races we have talked about before on the show, Pennsylvania, the race there, of course, is Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman as the Democrat versus TV personality Dr. Mehmet Oz as the Republican nominee. That's pretty much considered, I think Jacob and I can agree on this, that's going to be the toughest seat for Republicans to defend. The incumbent, Pat Toomey, is retiring there. He is, by the way, one of the 7 Republicans who voted to impeach Trump, so he will not be missed. But that is a very, very tough seat. Fetterman is seen as initially he was seen as a very strong candidate, although now, as we talked about, again, you guys can go watch the episode we did with Kyle, Fetterman's health has come into question, his refusal to debate Oz. Oz has just been hammering him on crime, among other things. So that could possibly be, it would be an upset at this point if Oz were to win that seat. But again, to hold that for Republicans. In Ohio, a state that went for Trump by 8 points twice. We talked about that with Kyle as well because he's from Ohio. J.D. Vance, the author of The Great Hillbilly Elegy, is running against Congressman Tim Ryan. There's still polls coming out in Ohio saying like, Tim Ryan could win. These are mostly garbage polls from Democrat pollsters. J.D. Vance should win just fine. Wisconsin, actually, incumbent Senator Ron Johnson is doing extremely well. He's actually consistently ahead in all the polls now. The aggregates overwhelmingly favor him to win over Democrat Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes by anywhere from 1 to 2 points. North Carolina, Congressman Ted Budd, he was running against former Governor Pat McCrory in the primary, and McCrory was seen as the frontrunner, former governor, statewide recognition. When Trump endorsed Budd, it was a huge upset, and Budd was still down in the primary polls, but then by the time the primary came along, Budd absolutely, wiped the floor with McCrory, and he won the nomination. He is the favorite to ultimately win against the former Chief Justice of the North Carolina State Supreme Court, Sherry Beasley, a total radical nut job. Absolutely, it would be a disaster if she were to win. It's fairly close there. It's a little too close for comfort, but Budd is still the favorite to win there. I think we probably hold North Carolina. You've got Florida, of course. Marco Rubio is running for re-election against Congresswoman Val Demings. He's widely expected to win re-election there, just like Ron DeSantis is for governor there. Iowa, Chuck Grassley's easily going to take that, no question there. Missouri, Attorney General Eric Schmidt is widely expected to win against Trudy Bush Valentine. That state, again, previously a swing state, it almost barely went for Obama by less than like half a percentage point in 2008, but it's become firmly red and firmly right-wing in the aftermath of the Ferguson riots. That's going to be an easy Republican hold there.
And then we got the Georgia race, which of all the incumbents, you would think that would be the easiest for Republicans to pick up, because if they just need one, all they got to do is hold what they've got, and then they knock off Raphael Warnock, which Georgia 4 years ago was a reliably red state. But because of the new coalition that Democrats have put together, it actually helps them in Georgia because they're relying heavily on college-educated voters and black voters. And Georgia has received a lot of in-country migration from the Midwest among middle-class black people. They've also got a huge influx of white California liberals because a lot of Hollywood companies have been filming a lot of their films in Georgia. Obviously, The Walking Dead was filmed in Georgia.
Yep.
And a lot of this has brought a lot of liberal capital to the suburbs of Atlanta. So Georgia should go red, but you've been following the Georgia race a little bit closer than I have, and I know the media has been throwing everything they've got at that race.
Yeah, the quick summary of that race is, of course, that is the seat that is held by Raphael Warnock, a black pastor, total radical, basically a black nationalist, who won that seat in the aforementioned in 2020. There was a special election for the Senate seat that, to go back a little further here, that was the seat where incumbent Senator Johnny Isakson, a longtime senator there, ultimately resigned due to health issues. So subsequently, Governor Brian Kemp, he appointed Kelly Loeffler to that Senate seat. Again, this rich businesswoman who had never held office before. She was challenged by Congressman Doug Collins, a really solid member, actually, of the House Judiciary Committee. He was really pushing back on like some of the Russia hoax stuff and whatnot, pushing back against the deep state. He ran against her, ultimately did not manage to beat her. That was another one of those elections where Georgia's a state where they have runoff elections, right? So Collins came in third in that open primary for that special election, and Loeffler came second, Warnock first. They went to a runoff. Warnock ended up beating her. So Warnock is up again now for re-election to a full 6-year term, and his challenger is Herschel Walker, the former NFL and college football player, widely considered the greatest college football player of all time. A celebrity who, of course, has not run for office before. He was encouraged to run for the office by Trump, basically ran because Trump told him to. And, of course, with Trump's endorsement, he easily won the nomination. And right now, yeah, he has good funding. Warnock is a fundraising machine, but Walker is matching him pretty nicely. Walker's got that celebrity status. Right now, yeah, I would probably bet more on Walker winning than Warnock. But they've been going all in on Walker on an alleged scandal here where a woman has now come forward to accuse Walker of getting her pregnant many years ago and then paying for her to have an abortion. Now, of course, this seems very much like an October surprise there in Georgia. Out of nowhere, this woman is a registered Democrat. This never came up before, only now, a month ago until the election.
And is there any evidence other than the woman's word? I coming forward and saying, is this like a Roy Moore situation where it's her word against his?
No, there's been no evidence whatsoever, and Walker has categorically denied it, has said it's not true. So this very much reeks of, like you said, a Roy Moore type accusation or a Kavanaugh accusation, purely for political purposes, and they are doubling down. They're tripling down on abortion scandal for Herschel Walker. But that to me,
this is what Democrats will do when it comes to social conservatives. So, for instance, they'll bring up a person's marital infidelity in the past or a person's divorce in the past. Now, they themselves, they have nothing against divorce. They have nothing against marital infidelity. They have nothing against abortion or paying for a woman to have an abortion that she impregnate. Their issue is the hypocrisy. They're trying to point out, well, look, this is hypocrisy in conservatives. They claim to be pro-life, but they support someone who paid for an abortion.
Mhm.
But the reality is the average conservative voter isn't as concerned with the moral life or the past of the person that they're voting for. They're more concerned with what kind of policies that person is going to implement. That's why the whole, all the scandals of Trump, his past marriages, and the whole, what Gate scandal that came out in 2016 did not faze many people because they were a lot more concerned with the policies that he would vote for and implement as president than they were his personal life. Yeah, most people, they don't like his personal life. A lot of people might even believe the stuff against Herschel Walker. What matters to them is how Herschel Walker is going to vote versus how Raphael Warnock is going to vote. You're not electing saints, you're not electing priests or pastors, you're electing politicians. And it's kind of assumed that politicians are going to have skeletons in their closet, but you just vote for whoever is going to implement policies you support. So I don't think this is going to damage Herschel Walker at all. In fact, I think this is just going to be a lot of wasted money and time on the media and Democratic Party's part.
Yeah, if anything, I mean, reports already came out that within 24 hours of the story first breaking, it was first a hit piece from the Daily Beast, because where else, of course, would it come from? Walker actually broke fundraising records in a 24-hour period. People, an outpouring of support of, they're attacking him. Again, just like Kavanaugh, just like Roy Moore, people have come to realize this pattern of BS, right? That this happens all the time, too conveniently, too coincidentally. And I think, if nothing else, the fact that they're resorting to this tactic, the left, the Democrats, the media, it shows they're afraid of him. They're realizing, he's a serious threat. We got to pull out our big guns, sexual misconduct allegations. And what they're trying to do is, like you said, social conservatives, they're trying to turn the base against Walker. They've realized that, demonizing him for their voters isn't working. The only chance they have is convincing Republican voters to not vote for him. Because if Republicans turn out, if the Trump base turns out, then he will absolutely win that election. So,
and I think one of the reasons why they're panicking in Georgia is because if you look at the map, ideally, you would think, if you look at recent history, you would think that Democrats would win Nevada, and then Arizona, Pennsylvania, Georgia would be up in contention. Democrats would take New Hampshire. Here's the problem, though. So obviously, Dr. Oz has had his struggles in Pennsylvania, and it's looked like Fetterman might take that one. Okay, let's assume they take that one. Let's assume that Republicans take Georgia. Let's assume that Republicans take Arizona. Okay, Democrats are still fine because they've got Nevada. But not so fast. According to 538, Nevada could be Senate Republicans' ace in the hole. And they point out that Cortez Masto, the Democratic candidate, is not that popular in Nevada. Now, the demographics in Nevada do not match the new reality of the Democratic Party. They have one of the small white populations in the country. They've got a very large white working class population. And I think they rank like 44th or 45th in college-educated voters. So if Democrats are relying on black voters and college-educated voters, then they're really in trouble in Nevada because Nevada simply doesn't have a high percentage of that. So if Republicans take Nevada, which right now Adam Laxalt, the former Attorney General of Nevada, is leading in the polls, which is something that nobody would have expected whenever you consider that Nevada voted for Obama by like 14 points back in 2008.
Yeah, he's leading consistently, like 7 of the last 8 polls. All the aggregates have him up by anywhere from 1.5 to 2 points ahead of Masto at this point. And an incumbent senator, that's a big deal.
So if he wins Nevada, if they win in Georgia, they win in Pennsylvania, and they win in Arizona, they completely, and they hold everything else like Florida and North Carolina.
Ohio, Wisconsin.
They're back to 53 seats. Yeah, they hold everything else. They're back to 53 seats. The Senate map in 2024 is much, much better for Republicans.
Yes.
They have a clear-cut shot at getting to a supermajority Senate, getting to a filibuster-proof Senate, and being able to ram through anything they want after 2024 with the Republican presidency.
Exactly. We talked about that, of course, in the episode about Mitch McConnell possibly sabotaging his party this time around to then ultimately get the majority in 2024 with more pro-McConnell people. But yeah, it's lining up perfectly between, you look at, especially with the Supreme Court already being the way it is, and governorships and state legislatures. Even after 2020, Republicans still control the majority of state legislatures. They could be setting up for a massive Republican dominance in American politics starting this year and continuing into 2024. And that's what Democrats are so afraid of.
Right now, 4 weeks out, I'm pretty confident. But there is the chance that we don't cover our flank. And that's what we're going to be talking about here.
And now here for the main topic of this week's episode, guys. We've talked about a lot of Senate races, individual races all across the country for the U.S. House, but there's always at least one race, one or two races that is, there's the makings of a potential upset there that most people don't pay attention to until it has already happened. This is one example in particular that if this were to ultimately be lost by the Republicans, the ramifications would be significantly worse, and I mean disastrously worse than just another Democrat winning. Of all places, it comes from the state of Utah. And for this discussion, I want to bring in an old friend of mine, another buddy from the Prager Force days, way back in the ancient times. The year of 2015 is when I first met him, just like how I met our previous guests, Joe Enders and Patrick Von Hanslick. My friend, a man I still consider to be one of the most talented journalists I have ever met and worked with personally, Josh Heckathorn. Josh, welcome to The Right Take.
Yeah, it's good to be on. Thanks.
Thanks for coming on.
Welcome, Josh.
You were actually the first person to bring my attention to the Utah race. You mentioned in our group chat, just kind of out of nowhere. I'm trying to think of what the discussion was before that we were having, but you just kind of out of nowhere just mentioned, hey guys, Mike Lee might be in trouble. So, Josh, and in the state of Utah, that's a pretty big deal, especially when you look at who he's running against. So, Josh, please go ahead and summarize for us as much as you want about the Utah Senate race and why Mike Lee is in trouble and who could possibly beat him in an upset there.
Well, Utah's always been a unique place as far as politics goes. And when it comes to this, I'll just put this down so I don't have to hear myself for a moment. As far as the Utah race goes, we have Evan McMuffin. Now, he first came out of nowhere in politics. He has a background in the CIA. No one really knows who he is or where he came from. But he just kind of magically appeared with a bunch of money like he did in the 2016 presidential race, where he got about a third of the state because he brought this weird demographic of anti-Trump Republicans and all. And Utah, though, it's obviously a vast majority Mormon. And early on, Trump was very unpopular with that demographic. But then by 2018, it was the most popular demographic that he was in. It was like 70% approval ratings, and Muslims were the bottom of the approval ratings, not surprisingly. And did you have a comment?
No, I just want to say that actually that's kind of surprising, not surprising, the part about the Muslims. But yeah, no, it's great. And I think it makes sense. Yeah, I mean, Utah is known to be a conservative state because of its Mormon population. And I could initially see for the same reason a lot of, evangelical conservatives, in general, social conservatives were wary of Trump, the multiple divorces and the Hollywood Access tape, blah, 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 like all that stuff. But like you said, by about 2018, of course, halfway through his first term at that point, he had governed with the strong social conservatism that these voters ultimately care about, that ultimately they turned around and were fully on board with him by the time he was running for re-election. So that makes sense.
And yeah, like usual, it's the Democrats and the left are trying to turn into a pro-Trump versus anti-Trump referendum. They kind of tried to do that in Wyoming. It worked out very badly. But Utah's a little bit differently because you have the conservatives there who are pretty wary after January 6th. They're the moderates who don't like controversy. They don't like culture war and stuff, in spite of being in the middle of it. And whether they like it or not, they're going to be targeted more and more. If you look at the things going on at the universities there, like BYU and others, there's a lot of pressure. But in spite of that, it's still one of the reddest states in America. But I think what I've noticed from being in very red states like Wyoming and stuff is the more Republican a state is, the less conservative it is, oddly enough. Because when the Democrat Party is so weak there, they don't have to really run boldly on anything. So usually you end up with a very moderate legislature, especially when you have lots of people with left-leaning views who run as Republican and find that there's many others like that. And so McMullin has came back out of nowhere again in the Senate race, but he's actually polled to be within striking distance. In fact, ahead in some polls. And of course, you could say the polling's bad and all, and that conservatives usually are undervalued. They don't value the turnout. But for him, he's basically running on Mike stood with Trump, basically, is what he's saying. And that he's flip-flopped on that. Because Mike Lee always has been a moderate Trump supporter, but kind of has gone back and forth. So he's going after that. Because unlike Mitt Romney, who everyone knows is anti-Trump, people aren't really sure about Lee. Like, wait, so Lee, you said you told Trump to drop out, and then you compared him to Captain Moroni, and then you were talking to him, but then you voted against his certification. So Mike Lee has kind of just gone back and forth, and it's caused him a lot of issues. And I think it's made him susceptible. So the money's there, and it's gotten so bad that the Democrats didn't even run a Senate candidate. They've literally basically just endorsed McMullin to try to take away a susceptible seat from a originally Tea Party-ish Republican. Mike Lee was elected in the Tea Party wave. Most people don't remember, along with Rand Paul, Ted Cruz, and others. They were all buddies back in the day. And now he's kind of become an outlier. And I'm not sure if Lee can deal with the challenge. But the main issue is Mike Lee at least has an identity, and McMullin doesn't, except I'm a nice bald dude who looked at the CIA. I can't tell you what I did, of course. And he's appealing to a constituency of moderate Republicans, which are a decent bit, and independents especially, but also Democrats. And that coalition, if he can turn them out, could actually turn a seat, I don't know, gray. What is the independent color?
It's yeah, like weirdest like grayish yellow on the Wikipedia map, at least, and in the polling graphs. Yeah, there's a lot. You've made a lot of great points there. There's a lot of stuff to break down. I love that's such a good point. Briefly off the Mike Lee subject, that the more Republican a state is, the less conservative it is. That is so true, because when the Republicans have such a dominant majority, they can afford to get complacent on the issues and not be as hard right as they would be. Like DeSantis, of course, governor of Florida, that's a state that obviously it's much redder now than it was just a few years ago, but it was always kind of a swing state. It was, either going to be 1 point for the Democrats and 1 point for the Republicans. So now that he's governor, he is just going all in on hardcore conservative stances, and obviously to his benefit.
And this is one of the reasons why Florida has actually become even more right-wing than, say, states like Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. It's because Florida Republicans actually had to stay on their heels and actually had to fight for every single election. Republicans in the neighboring states, with the exception of Georgia, which has recently become competitive, they didn't have to fight for anything. It was just assumed that they were going to win. So it makes sense that Wyoming, Kansas, Utah would be in a similar boat, that they just kind of become complacent and just go along with an R by their name.
Exactly.
I did want to ask about certain issues in the Utah race. Besides the Trump issue, are there major flashpoint issues that have become prominent in the Senate race? Like, I know Mike Lee is huge libertarian, a huge fiscal conservative. I know the Tea Party. Have fiscal issues become an issue in this issue? Have social issues become a major flashpoint? Other than, like, if you remove Trump from the equation, what issues are prominent in this campaign?
I would say some of the main issues are, I'd say socially they align on most things. It's kind of on social issues in Utah, you don't want to make a big deal out of those because people are pretty set on, the pro-life with some exceptions. That's also the official stance of the church there. But I'd say the issues are more so economic and foreign policy. McMullin is a neoconservative, is his background, primarily speaking. Not surprising. He was a CIA agent during the Bush days, so he probably was directly involved in that, and obviously came out of that with a strong belief in what he did. And as a result of that, he advocates for a much more aggressive foreign policy stance. While Mike Lee is more, you could say, I wouldn't say libertarian, but the populist stance for foreign policy is, generally speaking, don't get involved. Don't start new wars, especially with the biggest nuclear threat since the Cuban Missile Crisis, allegedly, according to Biden right now. So now's not a good time to try to get involved in the war. And also, it's expensive. So I'd say McMullin is very much the neoconservative, spend more money, raise more taxes. And he, in many ways, he wants to be like Romney, but Romney is more moderate than neoconservative. So and Mitt Romney's in opposition because he's refused to endorse either of them, which has really angered Republicans across the party. He's like, what are you doing? This is your colleague and stuff. I don't think Lee endorsed Romney when he ran either. But Romney won with 63% in 2018. He had a pretty good win.
And Mike Lee, of course.
I guess that's the.
I was just saying, Mike Lee is pretty popular in that state as well. Of course, as you mentioned, he was first elected in the Tea Party wave in 2010, and he won with 62% of the vote there. And then 6 years later, 2016, the same year Trump ran, he won re-election with 68% of the vote. So again, obviously Utah's a very Republican state, but it seems to me at least that Mike Lee is probably, and correct me if I'm wrong, Josh, seems to be probably the most popular statewide politician there. Again, up against Mitt Romney and the governor, Spencer Cox, who, like you said, the more Republican it is, the less conservative it is. Spencer Cox infamously earlier this year vetoed a bill passed by the state legislature to ban trannies from competing in sports of the other gender, no men and women's sports, whatever. He vetoed that. He pulled a Kristi Noem. So again, so-called conservative turns around and does that. But I think if we're looking at the poll numbers, as you mentioned, Josh, that it is scarily close. There was one poll that had McMullin. I gotta say, you say he has no identity, Josh. I disagree firmly with that. His identity should be that his name immediately reminds me of the McDonald's item. I mean, I just call him McMuffin. Every time I think of him, he's McMuffin to me. Because, yeah, it's easy to remember. So, Senator McMuffin, guys. Senator McMuffin. That's the title of this episode. But, yeah, there was one poll where he's up by 1. There's a couple others, yeah, within the margin of error. He's down by 2, down by 3. And actually, this is the beauty of this. We're recording this on a Monday night. I'm not kidding, guys. This happened to me, Josh, right as Jacob and I were connecting before I called you up. I got a notification, an email notification on my phone from my Gmail. I don't know how this happened. I don't know how the RNC, the NRCC, whatever, keeps finding me. And they're putting my emails on these lists, right? So I'm getting all these campaign emails. I'm getting it from Herschel Walker, blah, blah, blah. I've been getting a few emails from Mike Lee, and I ignore them. I haven't yet set them to the spam filter yet because I'm just so entertained by some of these the subject lines, the headlines of these emails. At 7 p.m., this pops up on my phone, an email from Mike Lee. The subject line, in all caps, says, "I'm losing." It goes on to say, "My opponent unleashed a poll showing him up 1 point," in all caps. Eric, I know I've reached out to you a few times about this, but I still need your urgent blah, 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 whatever. So that literally happened as we're getting ready to record this episode. So clearly Mike Lee seems a little bit scared. At least his fundraising email suggests that. And yeah, this certainly would be a massive upset because, like you said, Josh, the Utah Democratic Party, they had a nominee and they threw him off a cliff when McMullin announced that he was running, and they said that they're throwing all their support behind McMullin. So he has the support of the Utah Democratic Party. A few other third parties have endorsed him. So it's a one-on-one race between Republican Mike Lee and independent McMullin, who, let's be honest here, if he were to get elected, he would just be a Democrat. He'd be just like Bernie Sanders and Angus King, independent senators who are basically just Democrats. But like I said, this could be even more dangerous than just a typical Democrat win because this guy, his entire personality, or his backstory, I guess, Josh, as you said, he came out of nowhere in 2016 to run against Trump. Basically saying, "Oh, I am another one of those Lincoln Project types. I'm another one of those who left the Republican Party because of Donald Trump and his radicalism, sexism, racism, blah, 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 whatever." So he ran for president. He didn't do well nationally, but he did in his home state of Utah. As you said, yeah, he got 22% of the vote, which is the best performance for any third-party candidate in a single state since Ross Perot ran back in 1992. So, of course, it wasn't enough to take the state from Trump. Trump still ultimately won it. But he emerged as an early anti-Trump figure. Again, the Lincoln Project types absolutely love this guy. He's not a conservative in any way whatsoever. He's more of a leftist at this point on most of the issues. He, of course, is a neocon, like you said, hardcore foreign policy. But like you said, his entire history is "I hate Trump." His entire identity, political identity, it's like Miles Taylor, that weasel who wrote that anonymous op-ed of "I am the resistance inside the Trump administration," and he was some like baggage boy for like the CIA or something. So the worst thing about this guy is that if he were to get elected to the Senate, it would be just 6 years of this idiot grandstanding about how Trump is literally Hitler. That would be all he does. That would be all he does in the Senate. He wouldn't get anything done, but he would just be an absolute darling of the mainstream media because they would say, "Oh, he's a conservative who doesn't like Trump." So yeah, is Mike Lee like a real winner? Like is he MAGA? Is he America First? No. Like Jacob said, he's all about fiscal issues. He supports more legal immigration if it helps the GDP, whatever. But like Brian Kemp running for governor of Georgia right now against Stacey Abrams, I would be first in line if I was registered in Utah. I'd be first in line to vote for Mike Lee against this guy.
And I know a lot of conservatives really don't like Mike Lee because of his immigration position, which is understandable considering how immigration entered the forefront once Trump entered the scene. But you need to think about foreign policy. If this guy gets in, if Mullen were to get in, you're looking at a Mitt Romney on steroids, you're looking at a John McCain on steroids, and spending tens of billions of dollars on Ukraine and wherever else that the vast majority of conservatives don't want to spend their money on. So this foreign policy is the number one reason why this guy does not need to get in, because he will be a complete disaster.
And I think that'll be one of the big points of the race because of how big the foreign policy question is right now. As far as what are we going to do with Ukraine? Are we going to send them another $40 billion? Are we going to send troops in? What do we do if Putin uses a tactical nuclear device? And these are, real questions that we don't really have a coherent answer from our administration. And technically, it's the Senate's job to dictate foreign policy, even though they rarely do it, but it is technically their job. So I think when it comes to all races, you really need three things from what I've seen. You need name recognition, which they both have in the state at this point, after years of being involved. And you need money. They both have money. And enough money, more than enough money to campaign for a Senate race. Usually someone's lacking that. And the third thing is turnout. Now, I'm not sure if McMuffin will have the turnout. Because again, conservative voters, especially Trumper voters, have been historically badly polled. And the reason for that is not necessarily because the polling's nefarious. It's because if someone calls up a Trumper and says, hey, you want to take a poll? They say no, slam the phone down. They've been shown to be very unlikely to give any information to media or anything like that. They don't like being on record. And for good reason. Of course, when you have cancel culture, I can see why some are suspicious. But yeah, so I think that Lee is doing better than he looks, but it's definitely a real threat because if he can unite those coalitions, and if the anti-Trump fever is stroked high enough by media or the pro-war fever, he has a good chance. And also when you look at how Mitt Romney's in there, some people thought, oh, Mitt Romney could never get elected. He literally he's one of the only Republican senators to vote no. And he won with, like I said, 63% in 2018. And of course that was before the vote. I'm not sure if that vote benefited him or not now, or if he'll be able to stay in the future. He's only a first-term senator. But I think due to Mitt Romney being there at all shows that there's definitely a coalition that could push the envelope.
Absolutely, yeah. And even if he ultimately ends up losing, the fact that it could possibly be close is a bad sign in and of itself. Because, yeah, there's definitely talk about, like, Mitt Romney and what his future is. Because, of course, like, yeah, Utah is, like you said, not too long ago, it's a state that wasn't crazy about Trump. And now they seem to have warmed up to him just enough. But, of course, Mitt Romney still is fairly popular. Again,
but Mitt's opponent was weak. That was the main thing. Mitt's opponent was just some nobody state senator or whatever. Actually,
right. Yeah.
It's some doctor. I'm trying to remember his name. I feel bad. I literally met one person.
Something Kennedy,
Mike Kennedy was his name.
Something Kennedy. Yeah.
Mike Kennedy was his name.
That's right. He's
right. He's a really good guy, but didn't have the money, didn't have the name recognition. So, like I said, he lacked two of the things he needed to win. And that's why Mitt Romney came in.
Right. So if we're talking primary challenges specifically, because Mike Kennedy, of course, I think in the initial, like the convention tally, like he was narrowly ahead of Romney, but didn't have an absolute majority. Right. Yeah. So it had to go to an open primary where, of course, Romney completely blew him out of the water. So then if we're talking primary challenges, do you think if we're jumping ahead, because Romney is up again in 2024, he has hinted that he doesn't know if he's going to run for re-election. He may just, he's going to have that whole like, oh, I'm heading out to the pasture. Like, clearly this is not my Republican Party. I don't belong here anymore. That kind of thing. He may just not run again. But if he were to run again, do you think there are any possible challengers, Josh, who could like run against Romney in 2024?
I think there's challenges. I'm not sure there's any strong ones right now. I'd say the Huntsman would be the main threat to him. They're a billionaire Warren family, used to be the governors and stuff, and they're a pretty powerful family. If any Huntsman ran, not sure if Mitt Romney could beat him. And I think he may just be going in for one term. I think he may have just gone in literally just to vote no. Oh, to vote yes on the impeachment. That may have been the only reason he ran. Or, in my opinion, I think Mitt Romney's been groomed for leadership by McConnell. I think he very much fits the frame of a future Senate Majority Leader. Because McConnell, he can't live forever. That turtle's like, what, 84, 85 years old?
Mm-hmm.
And who's going to replace McConnell after, he dies in the Senate? What Republican, like lifelong moderate Republican, would he trust? And I think Romney could fit that frame perfectly.
That's a very good point, because absolutely you can tell that Mitch and Romney are the kind of guys who would get along quite well. You're right. Mitch is 80. He's going to keep being reelected until the day he dies. That actually reminds me of a point that was made. Like, I think someone on Fox, said it a long time ago, back when Romney was first running, because again, he ran in 2018. And a bit of a reminder, I hate having to do this, but a reminder is that when he ran in 2018, he was endorsed by, among others, Donald J. Trump. So, of course, President Trump couldn't have seen what was coming. But it was said back then that as Romney's getting ready to run, of course, once he won the nomination and was basically guaranteed to the Senate at that point, they said, never before in American history has someone been elected to the United States as a freshman junior senator with this much clout and name recognition and a certain status of seniority in the party. Former governor, obviously the most recent presidential nominee, albeit unsuccessful. He could have just, by virtue of his name alone, he could have easily become like the number 2 guy in the Senate or something. And realistically, had he just bit the bullet and swallowed his pride and gone with Trump and become an unapologetic Trump supporter, or even just a soft Trump supporter, he didn't have to go gung-ho Josh Hawley. He could have just been like maybe like a Lindsey Graham. Like he's still a moderate, but he's not going to attack Trump.
Lee.
Yeah, or like a Mike Lee. He easily could have been one of the most popular senators. He could have earned a spot in leadership. But no, he had to go against the base for his own ego because he didn't get the Secretary of State job or because Trump did what he couldn't do and he got elected president. And yeah, he threw away the goodwill with the base. Now, of course, at the end, the base doesn't choose who the Senate Majority Leader is. That does go to the Senate vote. But like you said, yeah, they get groomed by the previous leadership. That is an interesting thought that Romney could stick around for that reason alone, if nothing else. But he certainly, you can guarantee if he does run for re-election, he's going to face challengers. So yeah, you said John Huntsman is a very solid likelihood and a possibility. And yeah, former statewide office himself. Also, he served in the Trump administration. I think he was ambassador to China, if I recall correctly.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of Huntsmen, but they're all billionaires and they all hold cushy government positions, generally speaking. Generally, lots of ambassadors these days. But every now and again, they'll pop up as a governor or whatever.
Right. And of course, a few others. And I may or may not be checking the Wikipedia page for this, but Jason Chaffetz has also been talked about as a possible primary challenger. Of course, former congressman who went on to become a Fox News contributor after he left, so that could be another one. Certainly, he'd be more of like a firebrand type. John Huntsman isn't exactly a fire breather, but he could be more like a Glenn Youngkin. He's quietly assessing what is needed to win and could easily buy his way into the Senate seat at that point. Whereas Chaffetz might be good at throwing red meat to the crowd, but might not actually be able to turn out a coalition strong enough to beat Romney. But yeah, interesting times, very interesting times in Utah. This is definitely a race. Again, it seems like Mike Lee is aware that he's not doing well. So again, like that fundraising emails, like the one I just caught, could just be a desperate attempt to just get more money, like scare the base into giving him more money, although his strategists behind the scenes are doing exactly what they need to do to win. But these are the races you got to keep an eye out for, whether it's this or the Oregon governor's race or maybe even the New York governor's race. There's always at least 1 or 2 seats that ends up being a huge upset, and especially for the U.S. Senate, above all else. If it was a seat in Congress, whatever, if it was a governorship, or something like Sarah Palin's seat, like that sucks. But at the end of the day, the Senate matters the most. It is 50-50 tie. Republicans cannot afford to lose a single seat. Imagine, if you will, if they were to flip Nevada and Georgia, and then they lose Pennsylvania. So then, net gain of 1. We have a majority now. They lose Utah. Boom. They're back to 50-50, which basically means a Democrat majority with Kamala Harris as the tiebreaker. Right? If we were to lose out a majority because of a state like Utah, the Republican Party would deserve to just quit at that point. Like, just give up. Like, if you can't hold a red seat like that in an election cycle where you got Rust Belt seats up for grabs, you guys really need to reassess how well you protect your incumbents.
Well, and it shows that they're not really covering their flank. A good example is in 2020 with Georgia. No one expected Republicans to lose those 2 Senate seats in Georgia. Those were pretty much, it was considered light purple, but most pundits assumed that Republicans were going to take both those races.
And of course, Kelly Loeffler, rich, out-of-touch businesswoman who was part of that insider trading scandal when they first heard COVID was about to cause a market crash. So yeah, she deserved to lose that as far as I'm concerned. David Perdue, he should have been reelected. He was one of the best senators, especially on immigration, but Ossoff just was very well funded, again, like Warnock. Mike Lee doesn't seem to, in that sense, he's, not a bad, he's an established incumbent, but it seems like he is another one of those incumbents who's getting kind of complacent. And of course, we have seen this before. We saw that with Joe Crowley, who got beaten by AOC, Eric Cantor, who got beaten by Dave Bratt.
Yeah, 530 gave Mike like a 90% chance of winning, which I feel like is very inflated if you look at the polls. And Mike Lee isn't really campaigning. He's not hosting any events as far as I've seen for the past weeks. And, McMuffin and McMullen, whatever his supporters, they're out in force, recruiting, organizing, because, if Democrats can do one thing, they're very good community organizers. They have very good principles when it comes to that. So I think the most dangerous thing is having the Democrat political community organizers. They could deal with the turnout part. Because the number one issue, I think, for independent candidates, because I work with a lot of independent candidates, I think it's very interesting to try to win races that are impossible. I've helped put in some people who, statistically speaking, were not supposed to win. And it comes with building coalitions. And oftentimes my specialty has been working in areas that are considered unwinnable and looking for people who are a lot weaker. And like you said, when someone's in there for a while, and they don't campaign, especially if the seat was handed to them, when they actually are challenged, sometimes it takes them way too long to respond. They don't know how to organize a campaign. And even with money, they don't know how to spend it, so they just throw it at things. And I'm not sure how talented a campaigner Mike Lee actually is. I can't recall his original race, but I think right now he's losing in the ground game. But, it's because you lose the battle doesn't mean you lose the war, but I'm not optimistic at this point. And of course, I like chaos. So I think it's kind of funny to see an independent, beat a Republican in a state, because that hasn't happened since 1970. That was the last time a Democrat was elected.
Yeah, and again, this technically is not a Democrat. Like they say, oh, this is the first Senate race ever where a Democrat nominee didn't run. But like, let's be honest, this guy's basically a Democrat. He's basically, again, just like Bernie Sanders and Angus King. But yeah,
well, even worse, because at least Bernie Sanders is somewhat non-interventionist.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he's kind of there, and he's good on trade, and he up until recently was good on immigration. The thought of Evan McMuffin being a senator, a literal McMuffin being elected to the Senate, would be more competent and more effective than Evan McMullen would be. But he would be a total earache that you would never stop hearing about for 6 years. The media would blow him up and celebrate him as, again, a darling of the anti-Trump left. All that matters is control the Senate. If we could get a guarantee that we still have a majority even without Utah, then I see where you're coming from, John. We like chaos, right? We like a little chaos every now and then, because certainly Evan McMuffin would make for a great punching bag, someone that we could, just turn all our attacks on. But this is the time to get serious, because we need a majority. We have to have a majority if we're going to stop certainly Biden's appointees. That's one thing the Senate can do. And like you said, yeah, with foreign policy, the last thing we need, especially as Ukraine looks to not be getting any better, and all the talk now is, oh, could Putin be using tactical nukes? Could tactical nukes be incoming? We need people who are not about to vote to possibly send more American boys and girls to die in another war, if it gets to that point, or at the very least, yeah, more foreign aid, more billions to Ukraine, when we don't even know where the money is really going.
Yeah, McMullen's the media darling, definitely. And I think the main issue with Mike Lee is because he's trying to take the middle route and straddle the fence, he's trying not to put off the never Trumpers. But in doing so, he's offended the very staunch Trumpers. Most people who are very strong Trump supporters I've met don't like Mike Lee. And that will hurt his turnout. So I don't think Mike Lee will get the never Trump supporters, the anti-Trump people. I think it's a mistake on his part. So he's going to lose those people. And the Trump people will be offended because he tried to do that, and he'll lose them as well. And if you lose both those groups of people, that's why I think it's a danger, because he needs those people to turn out. Because what's your coalition at that point? Just the standard conservatives. Like, they're a sizable part of the population, but without the populist wing of the party, or the moderate wing of the party. I think that's the three wings of the party. You have moderates, populists, and conservatives. If you don't have the moderate vote and you don't have the populist vote, then I don't think you can win. I think you need to either go with one of those two groups or the other. And everyone wants to have everyone vote for them, of course, but that's impossible. You can't please everyone. And Mike Lee wants to please everyone. And his history has caused issues because more and more stuff keeps on being pulled up by the media about Mike Lee. Because Mike Lee was basically like, I feel like he tried to take the stance that after January 6th, he kind of wasn't affiliated with Trump. But then all these texts came out of him writing like legal defenses and legal advice. You know, he literally, there's a text from Mike Lee was like, I've been studying this for 14 hours a day, trying to come up with a case for him. So he was clearly trying to help out without being too public about it. You know, he wasn't walking around like Josh with his fist in the air, but in the background, he was trying to use his experience to help in any way he could. And because of that, I don't think it's convinced the Trump supporters, but I think it's really galvanized and angered the anti-Trump people, especially the more moderate ones who thought he was against him. So that's why I hate how every race has evolved with Trump for years and years and years. I wish we had a little more substance in races, but I think that's what they would try to make it down about. Because if you look at Cheney in Wyoming, it kind of became about that as well. Trump literally showed up and was like, don't vote for this woman. And then, you know, the Democrats and her, again, they rallied behind her, were like, if you are against Trump, vote for Cheney. And she was a neocon. And again, it was very similar circumstances. And I think it's going to be the same situation, except in this case, I think Utah's a lot more moderate and has a lot more Democrats than Wyoming. Wyoming just did not have enough Democrats. Utah does have a strong but small Democrat party, mainly in Salt Lake City. They have a little blue island there. So they're very organized, kind of similar to the Californian Republicans, I would say.
Oh, yeah.
As in they're very staunch about, they're not very moderate. They're very open about having more democratic socialist views. And I think it's an interesting situation. It's just interesting to me.
You've touched my heart, especially with mentioning the California Republican Party, just to think about like how that party barely exists, but what is left is just the worst of the worst combination.
They won a seat in the 2020 elections.
Exactly. Oh my goodness. Yeah. Because I mean, the base is overwhelmingly very conservative. The base of the Republican Party is hardcore conservative, socially and everything, but the leadership is still all these, ever since Schwarzenegger, they've always been this way. They are still so out of touch. They're basically Democrats. They basically think, oh yeah, global warming is real and more immigration is fine and blah, blah, blah. We're pro-choice. Blah, blah, blah. Like, it's the worst. And the voters feel so frustrated. That's why someone like Trump was perfect for them to turn to and cast a vote for him to express their frustration. Again, a statistic that is worth mentioning. There are more Trump voters in the state of California than any other state in the country, just over 6 million in 2020, more even than Texas, a state that he won. And it's funny you mentioned that, yeah, in Utah, there are more Democrats than there are in Wyoming. Just a friendly reminder, the numbers here, they're glorious. In the Wyoming primary that just happened, just over 170,000 people voted in the Republican primary, total, between Hageman, Cheney, and the rest of them. In the Democrat primary, just over 7,200. So, yeah, even if all of them voted for Cheney, she didn't have a chance. She did not have a snowball's chance in hell. Whereas in Utah, as you said, yeah, they got the big metropolis that is Salt Lake City. So it could be just enough between the independents, obviously the anti-Trump conservatives, quote unquote, and maybe some conservatives who are just disgruntled with Lee that might vote for McMuffin, or just as well, they may just stay home. They may just decide not to vote for him because they're not satisfied with him. And that could ultimately be enough. Is not necessarily people voting for McMuffin. If everybody turned out, if all registered voters in Utah turned out, I think we can agree Lee would probably win. And McMuffin probably knows that, which is why he just needs to turn out his base and hope Lee does not succeed in turning out his base, which could be what ultimately happens here.
I actually disagree, because I think McMullin is more popular with the general populace, but not as much with the voters. I was reading a good article from a Utah paper, the Deseret News, where they were saying, are these polls accurate? Because people looked at the polls and were like, how is this possible? And they were studying the polls that were more about the general populace in their polling methods had McMullin higher. And the ones that focused more on registered voters had Mike Lee higher. And again, like we said, it comes down to the turnout. So I think it would just come down to, like you said, I don't think the conservatives will vote for McMullin, but will they turn out for Mike Lee? And I'm not so sure, because he has to define himself. McMullin has not defined himself at all, in my opinion. But Mike Lee has also had issues defining himself because he's defined himself repeatedly, but it's a bit of a contradiction in the public mind about who he is. And I think the race is good for Utah, but not good for the National Republican Party because it does bring up valid issues about where does Utah stand on things, where does Mike Lee stand, and when things are more competitive, it causes people to become more take a side. Because in states like I mentioned where it's not competitive, they take a very mushy, moderate establishment view. But when it's close and competitive, then they take a more hardline view. And also, if you're a party with no power at all, then you just become an extremist, like third party, basically faction in the state. That's how you know your party is basically in a state like the Republican Party in Delaware, to give an example, or the Democrat Party in Wyoming. They basically don't exist anymore.
Exactly. Yeah. And that could also bring a good question is that inevitably, if, say, McMuffin were to pull this off and were to win, even by a narrow margin, which I imagine if he wins, feel free to jump in and correct me there, Josh, if he wins, it would probably be a narrow margin, like maybe single digits, low single digits perhaps. But point being, if he were to pull that off in this Senate election, then the discussion inevitably would turn to, oh, is this a sign that Utah could stop going red? Like, if Trump runs again against Biden, could Biden win Utah this time? Which I would assume from an outside perspective looking in, no, Utah would still be a reliably red state in presidential elections. It would just come down to in these more specifically statewide elections for Senate, for governor, what have you. That just comes down to individual candidates. And again, like you said, someone like McMuffin, who's actually managed to make himself fairly popular in the state of Utah.
Yeah, I think Utah is heading in a very purple direction at the state level. Like you said, the presidential elections, I think they'll always vote red probably. But I think in the upcoming decades, you'll see the state turn a lot more purple. Because I feel like a lot of Republicans especially have libertarian leanings when it comes to things like immigration and trade. I feel like the Republican voters there are more open to those subjects as far as a little more left-leaning, while being stricter on issues that are foreign policy and other fiscal issues. Like I'd say the main reason Trump became popular is because Obama took away land from the state of Utah, basically, and this one place, I can't remember what the name of it. And when Trump came in, he gave back the land, and people basically celebrated that because Utah is mainly owned by the federal government. It's like over half the state, and now some people are not very happy with that. So that kind of gained Trump a lot of supporters there, and also he took a more friendly stance of appeasing leadership there within the community and visiting with them and talking with them and taking pictures. Well, before he had kind of shunned be seen in public with them, probably so he didn't offend evangelicals, which is understandable. But yeah, it's going to be an odd region, seeing what happens in Utah, Nevada, because we have some interesting races in Nevada. I don't know as much about those, but it looks like Republicans are about to flip Nevada.
Yeah, we were just talking about that actually.
Oh, yeah.
That Nevada is looking, and I have friends in Nevada who one buddy of mine who told me this says that a key thing going on with Nevada is that of course you have strong statewide candidates running now. Adam Laxalt, the nominee for the U.S. Senate, former Attorney General there, easily he said he's the strongest candidate we could have possibly had running for any statewide office. But in Nevada, what you had there is the Democratic Party for the longest time was basically could have just been called the Harry Reid machine. It was Harry Reid's party. He ruled that thing with an iron fist. And when he died, he basically took that machine to the grave with him. And there apparently have been splits in the Democratic Party statewide leadership there in Nevada between the former Reid acolytes and Bernie bros. Because, of course, remember, Bernie ended up winning the Nevada primary. So that Bernie bros getting elected to key leadership positions drove away the Harry Reid supporters and more moderate Democrats, quote unquote. So the state party is kind of fracturing, and strong Republican candidates running there as well. And Nevada's always been a close state. It's always been a close state in 2016 and 2020. So it was always just within reach. I would assume Republicans didn't go as hard for it before because it is worth only 6 electoral votes. It's not like Nevada, except for a really close election. Nevada is not going to be the state that, swings the whole election. That's going to be like a Florida or a Wisconsin or Pennsylvania. But now that it really matters, the Senate race, again, in this very close battle for 50-50 support, evenly split Senate, every race counts, and that is one of the 3 Democrat-held Senate seats that they absolutely have to flip. And yeah, at this point, it looks like that, ironically enough, up against Georgia and Arizona, the other 2, the one that looks most likely to flip is Nevada. So we'll be keeping an eye on that one for sure, and we'll be discussing that one further here on the show.
Yeah, and as we mentioned before, Nevada is called the ace in the hole by 538, but I mean, as things are looking, Republicans are going to take the Senate. The one thing that could screw that up is Utah, unfortunately. I mean, that could end up being the state that keeps it 50-50 or throws it 51-49 to Democrats, even if Republicans do pull out in Nevada.
Just imagine, if you will, a timeline where we flip Nevada, we manage to hold Pennsylvania somehow, like Oz manages to win, and yet Utah still costs us a Senate majority.
Well, it's the freaking Mormon vote. It's very odd. Nevada is about 7% or so Mormon, and that doesn't sound like a lot, but they're an extremely organized voting bloc. Basically, all of them vote compared to the general population, and they usually vote together. Now, Harry Reid was a Mormon, a very prominent one.
I actually didn't know that. Interesting.
Yeah, he actually converted one of his Senate colleagues.
Wow.
And baptized him.
That is interesting.
So he had a very strong bloc behind him, and over time, it used to be that Republicans and Democrats are kind of even among the LDS Mormon community. But then over time, after Reagan especially, who really reached out very friendly towards them, it made a major shift. And that major shift over time has caused some issues in states like Utah, Arizona, Wyoming, Nevada, Colorado, and especially in like northern Arizona in Wyoming. Now, there's basically 2 types of Mormons in the United States. There's Utah Mormons and the millions that live outside of it. Now, the ones inside Utah are quite moderate. The Mormons that live outside of Utah are very conservative, generally speaking. Like me, I'm from Maryland. The ones there are a lot more conservative, and also the California Mormons as well. And Harry Reid was kind of an outlier there. So because Harry Reid's gone, they've lost that 7% right there, basically, automatically. Because they related to him and liked him. So they lost that, and I think that's enough to tip Nevada over in that direction. The same with Arizona. There's a lot of articles on the subject. But in Utah, oddly enough, it's I think what might tip against the Republicans, because you have we call it the bubble. Basically, Utah we call it a bubble, where they have their own culture and their own thing because they're the majority there. And when you're the majority, you behave in a certain way. Like if you're Italian in Italy, you're proud to be Italian. You kind of assert yourself. But when you're a minority, you're a little bit more polite to people. You don't really want to be, in the public eye, and you kind of get a little bit angry and a little bit more extreme. And so that's what you've kind of seen in other places in the country within the Republican Party, and that's why there's that split there between kind of the Mike Lees and Mitt Romney, even within Utah. But outside of that, you had other forces as well. But yeah, I'd like to see what happens in Nevada. I don't know as much about that race.
Again, that's something else you've just taught me, Josh, and I didn't know that. Because, of course, a lot of analyses looking at Nevada is, the Latino vote shifting more to the right could be what flips Nevada, because, of course, there is a decent Latino population there. And, yeah, it is well documented that for whatever reason, we can talk about the reasons and why all day long. Spoiler alert, it's immigration. But why Hispanics are shifting towards the GOP. But people generally say, that's why Nevada could go red. Again, to realize that, Harry Reid had this kind of grip on a small percentage of the Mormon, the small percentage of the overall population the Mormon community made up in Nevada, that could have been the linchpin that ultimately brings it all crashing down. A state that has been pretty consistently blue, narrowly blue, go completely red. Again, not only Adam Laxalt, but Sheriff Joe Lombardo running against Steve Sisolak, the governor there, and that could also be another Trump-endorsed candidate. That could also be another example of a statewide blue seat flipping red. So that, and again, electorally, it's not much. It's 6 votes. But these days, I think everything counts, and any victory is worth it. So,
but 2 Senate votes counts.
That's right. Yes. Yeah. Exactly.
It comes down to the Banzef Power Index, which is, to explain to regular viewers who don't read boring books all the time, it's basically the percentage that you need to flip a vote. So if you have 50-50, the Banzef Power Index is literally 1 senator. That's why Senator Manchin from West Virginia had the president meeting with him, begging him to vote on the bill. If it was 60-40, no one would talk to him. ever. No one would care. So if you look at Canada and Quebec and stuff, you have a small but very organized French population. They constantly have to kind of appease them. And they're a minority in the country, you know. They could never win on their own, but everyone needs them to win. So that's kind of why you have the whole appeasement of the Mormons in the West, or of the evangelicals in the Deep South, or of other groups in the Northeast. Whenever you have a minority group that can be swayed, that can flip the vote, then they become that power index. And I think that's what's happening in Nevada.
Very fascinating. That I again, one more thing I did not think about that, but yeah, it really is true that a guy like Joe Manchin of all people has, I guess, along with Kristen Sinema, kind of have become the absolute kingmakers of the Senate. And everybody, it is pretty funny, I'll admit, seeing Democrats just collectively groan and lose their minds whenever Manchin and or Sinema comes out and says, nope, I'm not voting for this, not having this. And they just like, all right, back to the drawing board. It is admittedly pretty great after we had to endure 2 painful years of Republicans in the majority under Trump do absolutely nothing with it. It's pretty satisfying to turn around and see the Democrats essentially do the exact same thing. And I mean, granted, they have gotten more done with their majority, quote unquote, than the Republicans did under Trump's first 2 years. To see these efforts fail because they have just that slim of a majority is very satisfying, to say the least. Well, thank you so much, Josh, for joining us here on The Right Take. We really appreciate your insight on everything from Utah to other states and other elections and the key votes that may influence elections that you didn't even think about. This is all really fascinating stuff, and we'll be happy to have you back on the podcast anytime you want to come back on, man.
Yeah, it was good to be on. Nice talking to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you guys, as always, for tuning in to this episode of The Right Take. Be sure to follow us for all of our latest content and more at our website, righttakepodcast.com. The full list of podcast platforms and social media websites where we are available, righttakepodcast.com/subscribe. And as always, if ever you guys are feeling oh so generous, righttakepodcast.com/support. We'll talk to you next week, guys.